Welcome everyone. Apologies that I'm having to hold this microphone like a kind of 1950s, I don't know, pop star or something, whatever they called them then. This is apparently the only way that my audio is audible. So welcome to the second seminar of our Caribbean Studies Network. I'm William Koch. I teach in the English department here. When we were starting the network, a question we had as conveners was, how does the practice and method of doing scholarship in the humanities change if we take the Caribbean as our starting point, as our sort of first point of reference and the point from which we work outwards? And when I thought about that question, the first scholar who came to my mind was Colin Dayan, currently the Robert Penn Warren Professor of the Humanities at Vanderbilt, and here she is, and Colin's speaking to us today from Nashville, Tennessee. Colin's 1995 book, Haiti, History and the Gods, which is one of my favorite books, is about so many things. It's about religion and race and the social formation of the Americas. It's a work of history, it's a fieldwork journal, it's a work of social criticism, and it's a kind of album of Gothic tales. But above all else, it's a book about Haiti and about how inhabiting and studying that place transforms the way we understand all those other categories and genres. So I asked Colin if she would talk to us today about her work on Haiti and about its afterlife, both in her own work and in the work of others. It would take me ages to go through her many publications and honors, but for the moment, suffice to say that her subsequent work has developed two very closely related stems of thought from the Haiti book. One, the human animal taxonomies and the way we understand the human person in the aftermath of Atlantic slavery. And two, the imprint of that on contemporary legal and carceral practice. And a key expression of this work was her 2011 book, The Law is a White Dog. Colin suggested in advance of the seminar that we might want to circulate passages from those two books, from Haiti and from The Law is a White Dog, which closely relate to one another, and which also relate, very regrettably, with contemporary British and American societies and social institutions still. Now, I know some of you have got these texts and will have read them, and I know some of you won't. So the idea is that it's obviously entirely accessible to everyone. And if you haven't read these books, will hopefully whet your appetite to do so. So for the structure of the session, Colin's going to just talk about that work for 15 minutes or so. I have some questions, and then we'll open it up pretty quickly to the audience. So do ask a question at any time as it strikes you through the Q&A box on your Zoom app. And I'll gather those up and put them to Colin as we go along. And obviously any follow-up questions or clarifications are really welcome. So all that remains to be said is how grateful we are to Colin for speaking to us this morning. I know this is a very hectic moment for her. Her new book is coming out very shortly, and we'll talk more about that. And we're very honoured as a new network that Professor Dayan has agreed to speak with us today. And as we only have an hour, I'll hand over straight away to Colin.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm delighted actually to be here in this virtual world and to be asked to come back to Haiti, History and the Gods. Which transformed my life, changed my life, because I had spent a long time in Haiti from the 70s and been very involved with voodoo. And one of the things that possessed me as I sat down to write was the problem of bringing an unwritten history into the academy, and how to talk about field work in such a way that it was not just limited, to anthropologists. But most of all, I wanted to demonstrate that the cognition, the thought that we took away from those who were slaves and the descendants of slaves, the idea that there was no thought worth having if you were one of those who were most oppressed. I wanted to demonstrate or ask how thought is given life in voodoo ceremony. So that's how it began. And for me, I've been long obsessed with the notion of ritual. The idea, it's always fascinated me that you can take, the most common thing, a Coke bottle, stick it in the middle of a ceremonial surround, and it suddenly can become a transformative object that will call down the spirits and bring you into a place that can only be called spiritual, but it is the most filled with matter. So I found in doing this work that it was a way for me to set a terrain for writing that would no longer have oppositions work in the same way. It wasn't just a matter of, destroying a Cartesian ontology. It was more that you could actually get into dirt and get to the ground and find there the only way to understand the working of history. So that what for me was so exciting was to retrieve out of a religious practice that was seen as substandard or non-existent, to retrieve the life of the spirit working itself through situations that were most oppressive and where those who suffered were most silenced. So it was a political journey as well. And when I returned to Haiti to do the field work, this will date me, Papa Doc had just been overthrown. There was great sense of possibility and déchoucage. And then you all know that it was all for naught. But the question for me was always, what about the majority of people who are still in Haiti and still work and live, and what has happened to this mode of thought? However, I think one thing we can discuss is the way in which Haitian voodoo practice actually has a great deal to tell us now, and that is, one thing I wanted to kind of get across, the living presence of the spirits of voodoo. Also, I wanted to talk a little bit about how I got involved. Besides just the fieldwork in Haiti, I was obsessed with Dessalines, and I was fascinated that none of the historians, wrote about Dessalines. I mean, even C.L.R. James and the Black Jacobins. Dessalines was kind of like an afterthought, an aside, a fascinating character, but he wasn't seen, at least certainly not academically, as a fondateur. And so I wanted to retrieve Dessalines, and I was fascinated that it was in the ceremonial surround, in the practice of voodoo, that Dessalines still lived. And again, that was bringing me back to ritual practice as a way of understanding what I call the cult of the remnant, or the remnants of a history many would prefer to be forgotten. So it was a very exciting, it was an exciting project to take the piecemeal, or the shards of what people thought was trash, and to somehow revisit and rethink and definitely resurrect the spirit of the law. And some people wondered, when I started working more fully in prisons and the law, what this had to do with the early work. And I guess that's something that I most wanted to speak to now, that, I mean, I would have never written The Law is a White Dog if it hadn't been for the Haiti book. And again, I wanted to give flesh and blood to the law. So in a way, what I was doing with the law and The Law is a White Dog was an attempt, as odd as it might sound far-fetched, to incarnate or embody, materialize legal codes that many thought only the elite knew or understood. You know, law was just for lawyers. And I wanted to re-enliven the law and treat it really as if we could learn something about legal practice through understanding it as deeply corporealized and perhaps more irrational than the abstract precepts of law were deemed to be. And so I was seeking out the unreason and the irrationality and the magicality in law. And I mean, I think that's the thread probably in all my work, is to destroy the idea that the world of the spirit is an impalpable, transcendent world, and to somehow just make both realms, what we call matter, what we call spirit, intensely porous, and what I like to call, way back in the Poe book, convertible, that we're in a terrain where oppositions are not the thing, the dichotomies are not where we want to land on one side or the other, but the interstitial. So as I wrote in the Haiti book, I still inhabit what I could only call, a provisional locale, a place that is always ambivalent and not certain. I think that's really important, that the sense of where one stands when one reads or one learns or one inhabits the world. And I want us to be somehow in the thick of it, working out from that and from the ground up, but rather than, working with an abstraction, so that then, of course, led me to a real problem that perhaps we can discuss a bit, and that's the divide between animality and something called humanity. And the world of the non-human has become, for me, the world that I'm most intrigued by now. And that is what led to the dog book, With Dogs at the Edge of Life. But both memoirs are really about the ways that one can no longer think of personal identity apart from what might seem to deny it. And perhaps I wonder if I should stop there. I've just thrown out a few of the main goads, shall I say, or prompts to my life and my work. And I think that's, probably about it, except one other word, the supernatural. The terminology of the supernatural has always bothered me. And so I will say that both books wanted very much to take the natural and kind of literalize what we mean by supernatural. It's not something beyond, it's not something, out of the world, but rather it's all too natural. So again, I'm interested in what might resist abstraction and what might be the not building blocks so much as pieces that one lives in and gathers for resistance in our work, and in our lives. The details, that wreck any totalizing idea, that for me seems crucial. So that again, I see the work as an intervention into the academy that I hope raises questions, and doesn't have necessarily any kind of firm answer, but it's a process. It's a, kind of mode of discovering and thinking again. Always, though, I think that voodoo is in my life and behind the work I do. And that, I think, is the main thing I would say. When I asked in the Haiti book, how are gods made? I think I said something like, I'm also asking how are histories told? And so clearly, for me, the world of something called the divine is very much resistant to anything otherworldly, very much in the world and taking its lifeblood from, as I said, the things that might resist, it would seem, the question of divinity or the question of spirit. So, that's a way, I suppose, into the work, but I would really like to hear questions because, as Will reminded me, we're 25 years later, which is, from Haiti history and the gods. So I really look forward to returning to it through your questions, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. So as I say, there's the Q&A box on the bottom of your screens is there for posting questions as and when. So do get posting in there. I'll start with a couple of questions while you're populating it, and then I'll start feeding them through to Colin. I wanted to begin with if you might talk. You spoke a little bit about the relationship between your desire to go to Haiti, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the kind of the sources or the origins of that desire, both perhaps in the kind of the intellectual origins in terms of the work you've done on Poe and on René Depestre, and on the other hand, the kind of personal or familial reasons why that oriented you towards Haiti as a subject.
Well, thank you. That's a big question. When I started working on René Depestre in college, that was because we were in the 70s, the early 70s, and it was the time of revolution, we thought. And I was an English major, and I was supposed to be doing a thesis on Pound and Eliot, and they had very narrow ideas of what poetry was. And I discovered through a person who was teaching, I was at Smith College, and Roberto Marquez was at Hampshire. And we met, and he found out that I was translating René Depestre, and he knew him. Depestre was in Cuba then, and he brought my translations to René, and we started a correspondence. However, at Smith, they said there was no way that I could switch the subject to Depestre and to Negritude, which was what I was interested in doing, that this was an English honors thesis. And their famous quote was, "Poetry can justify revolutions, but revolutions can't justify poetry," I was told. So I went to UMass Amherst, and there Thomas Kucera took over and said he would advise the thesis. And at that point, Smith said, well, okay, go ahead, write it then. And that's what happened. They allowed me not to take any classes that year, and somehow I was given this time to work on the Depestre translations. So the Dépêche was originally a rainbow, un arc-en-ciel pour l'Occident chrétien, and Minerai Noir. I was translating both those works. And that's where the Haiti work actually began for me. Because when I told my mother, and both parents actually, that I was working, I'm going to go to Haiti because I'm going to talk to people about Dépêche. This is, 1970. She said, well, Haiti? Well, don't do, I don't want you, Robert. What do you work on Haiti? I did not have a full sense about my mother's past in Haiti. When I decided to work on it, where does a full sense come from? I mean, she clearly, as time went on, it was clear that she was a Dessalinienne. She sang, the songs to Dessalines, but for her, she was French. And her whole past was vexatious. Her life was, and I think that both the memoir that I wrote, is about her, because, the uncovering of her past in Haiti is something of a tragedy. I had never asked to see her houses in Bois-Vernant, well, where she was born and raised, in Bois-Vernant, in Turgeot, in Port-au-Prince. Somehow I too was following in this kind of way of not acknowledging my mother and Haiti, maybe out of respect for her. I don't know, since they were living in the South and she had become, completely disconnected. However, after the earthquake, when I did decide to go to Turgeot and Bois-Vernant, there was nothing left. And Sacré-Cœur, the school where she was brought up and raised, and where the nuns used to, she said, look at themselves in their mirrors. They were all, the whole place was no longer there. Sacré-Cœur, just the cross. So I went back to find my mother in the ruins of Haiti. And, I think that the retrieval of that past, for many, many reasons, has shaped a lot of the oddities of my life and the choices of work. And I guess that's the best way to answer it. It had a great deal to do with finding the mother I didn't have. Yes.
Fascinating. You mentioned there, getting to know, sorry, I'll hold it up better so you can hear me. You mentioned getting to know René Dépestre, or entering into a correspondence with him. I wondered if you might talk a little bit about the Caribbean thinkers, the Haitian thinkers, the Pan-Caribbean thinkers. I know someone like Kamal Brathwaite has been very influential on your work. How you read them and discovered them and how they shaped your work.
Well, Dépestre was always, for me, Dépestre was a radical. I went to him because he incarnated for me a way of writing, especially in an arc-en-ciel pour l'Occident chrétien and the epiphany of the voodoo gods, a way of bringing the gods and into full-on revolt. And the beautiful thing about A Rainbow for the Christian West is that the gods, the whole setting is a possession ritual whereby the gods inhabit the head of a poet and go with him one by one to a judge's house in Alabama, which of course spoke to me then when I was so young and getting out of the South. And his later work, which was a work of kind of great love for him. Having lived in Cuba, he felt, I think, that it had, as he told me, destroyed his lyricism. And he wanted to re-find it. And for him, lyricism had to do with eroticism and women. And so his works, Alléluia pour une femme jardin, and his later works were, in his mind, treating Eros as a moyen de connaissance. And I somehow fell away from De Pestre in my closeness to him and my sense of him. I suppose I still missed the radical De Pestre, the De Pestre from the 1940s. But as he told me, you know, he would look very foolish, you know, in the south of France in Lézignan-Corbière, still writing as he did when he was, you know, in Cuba. So he's a tremendous, you know, person, human being. But I lost the Caribbean for a little bit, because when I went to graduate school, and I was a dancer, so I didn't want to give up. I was in a company in New York, and I didn't want to give up all of it. So I went to the Graduate Center, which was amazing, on 42nd Street, City University, part of CUNY, and it was amazing. They said I could do part-time, my doctorate, and still dance. Of course, the work took over and I stopped the dance, but they still did not think that De Pestre, Césaire, and all that should be part of my complete, you know, work. So the Caribbean for me in those days was still kind of undercover. And I got my doctorate, you know, in 77, 80, sorry, 80. And I just, you know, the world of the Caribbean was always a world of freedom of thought, because it was somehow carried out, you know, undercover. But it was beautiful because all of the Caribbean was working within me when I was doing my dissertation on Mallarmé and Hegel, so which they loved. That was a subject, you know, Hegel's Science of Logic, Mallarmé's Ouverture ancienne des reliables. You can do that, but I think that my Caribbean work took off because it was always the treasured underground place, like so much of my life. You see that the things that were hidden were always the things that contained the force, the power, and allowed me really to think thoughts that maybe I might not have thought if these things had been accepted in mainstream. So I don't know if that answers your question. But...
No, it very much does, and that's absolutely fascinating. So I'll just ask one more question, and then I can see we've got some questions beginning to populate the box. I suppose a final context that I find in your writing that I'm interested in is we've touched on Haiti and you know the studying up in Smith and at CUNY, and the kind of the mediating space there, both in your life and of course, you know, geographically and in a certain kind of cultural movement, is the South. How has you talk a lot about that in your work, that sense of the South, and there are wonderful moments in the Haiti book where people like Faulkner just kind of appear in the background and seem to sort of hover there. You know, Absalom is a very kind of presence, great absent presence, or present presence at times in the book. How has that sense of Southernness and that sense of a Southern Gothic tradition or a Southern literary tradition influenced your work?
That's a wonderful question. You see, I never would have thought of it, frankly. I wouldn't have thought of the South at all. I mean, it wasn't, you see, as long as I was in the Northeast, things were very different for me in terms of the work. I came back to the South. My mother was dying in Atlanta. I was the only child. And I was told basically, she's not going to get out of the hospital unless you can come back. So I left the University of Pennsylvania in Princeton, and I came back. And there, I think, to answer your question, the South hit me in the face. Nothing, I wouldn't say that anything I don't know, I can't really speak to it, but I was going to say, I wouldn't say that anything I did before coming back here, I would call it, you know, Southern Gothic. And I kind of hate the idea that I too now am Gothic, but it has happened, I think. You know, it's kind of impossible to say. I think if I hadn't come back, I would have never done memoir. Certainly not. I would have continued with my legal work and continued the book on forfeiture that I was doing, which I hope to get back to. I went into the stupid memoir idea, and I call it stupid because once you write a memoir, excuse me if I say this, but it's a doom. It's a doom because, you know, editors have this idea of the memoir and of the things that sell. And I want to say that the original book was a big book. It was called Blue Book, and it was all mixed up. Now there's a book called In the Belly of Her Ghost and Animal Quintet. Originally, they were all together. So the mother was mediated by the soil of the South. The whole problem of autobiographical thrills was mediated by a fantastic soil of complexity, which was the natural world. And what you now have is the mother in the belly of her ghost. And now to come, the Animal Quintet. So for me, when I say, you know, it was a tragic kind of thing, the division, the dismemberment, the separation. And I think we could reflect on what do people want when they say memoir? Well, they want the person. They want to get into this single, you know, identifiable person who went through something. And the beauty of the original was that there was not a person. No person. It was a world of things that meant something to thought, right? And you can still see that, I think, in the Animal Quintet. The problem is that, you know, if I hadn't found, I think, the photographs, you see that, if I hadn't found the photographs in the boxes that came here from my mother's house, if I hadn't found them and had them, I think I could have, the two would have been together. But I think the photographs of the mother were such a strong presence. They wanted that, you know, I'm only surmising. I think people thought that it would, you know, be powerful to understand this woman as if you could understand anyone, right? Understand in that sense. So I hope one day I'll be able to do Blue Book. And had I been able to come to England for the talks, Garth and Andrea were going to retrieve Blue Book in a sense, and the talks were going to be around the original pile, the pile up of memory, which was somehow, you know, divided into two. That's the story of, you know, what can happen to memoir. Everybody has an idea.
That's absolutely fascinating. No, I mean, that relates to there's a wonderful passage in some point in Haiti where you say, I disdain the idea of identity politics or personal criticism, that savvy recentering of the self one claims to be decentering. And I've always thought, reading that work, and indeed reading Laura's White Dog and so forth, that there is this kind of interesting relationship between the subjectivity that's clearly mediating this stuff, but that's constantly kind of decentering itself and trying to position itself in relationship to materials and others. So it's fascinating to know about that kind of compositional history of the memoir. We've got some great questions now in the question box, and we've got a number from Rachel Douglas. So
yeah, I see something from Rachel here. Is there anything you would like to add or change 25 years on. That's such a great, no. I know it sounds absurd. No, I can't imagine, which is so fascinating, because the reason I say no is because in going back to it and looking at it, I started like reading parts of it aloud. I have to say that the Ezeli for me still is it's kind of the meat of it all. It captures, this whole sense that in Haiti and in Voodoo, you had a way of thinking sexuality and gender that people have not yet even begun to comprehend. And Ezeli captures it. Also, the destruction of any idea of the virginal as opposed to the promiscuous. I don't think I could change it. I suppose I would like to find new ways to live it in the sense of writing, new ways of finding those places where a figure like Ezeli or a belief practice like service for Ezeli or Dambala could be refound. I do think that the discipline of service, service, is a remarkable way of thinking about the passage through life. Because if you are living with the spirits or the Loa, the demands are unceasing. And I think the demands are always about the very things that I like most, which is, can you write out of a position of harm or confinement, or somehow, can you be in a place where the demands keep coming and you somehow change over time with the demands? And I have to say that Dambala, as a spirit, as an ancestor, is an incredibly demanding law. So, a friend said, don't talk about it. You don't have to say that you are a practitioner. And I thought, what? Well, I think I do. I mean, I will admit that when I wrote the Haiti book, the gods were not as they were not as central. But a number of Haitian friends have passed away. And I think with each passage, Haiti came more and more to be part, and especially the ancestors came to be part of my life, and the sense of what that means to honor the dead, who do not die. And that's what Brathwaite understood. For Brathwaite, the ancestors were everywhere. And when he moved to Cattle Wash, when he moved out there in Barbados to his pasture, he knew the ancestors were there. And that's what he wrote me. And the heartbreaking thing is they started to take over his land. And that was the land of all the gods for him. So, the world of the spirit does live on. Whether or not that makes one, somehow delinquent or somehow primitive, I love it. I love the idea of contending with those who think of people as somehow categorizable as backward or primitive. So anyway, a long way to try to answer your question. And Rachel's question, I don't think I could write it quite like that now. But I would like, Rachel, to write about the Baka. I would like to go and start thinking about the spirits in Haiti that were seen by many people as evil, the people who turned into animals, the shapeshifters, the things that come out at night. I would be very interested in writing about those infinitely degraded spirit entities that inhabit the soil. So it wouldn't be, taking a loi like Ezali or loi Desaline, but it would be trying to retrieve the spirits that are part and parcel of the night and the earth. And they only get a small thing in Haiti History and the Gods, I think. I called it Tools of Terror. So I certainly wouldn't have, I wouldn't probably use that terminology now either. But thank you for those questions.
And there's another question right at the top about James and Dessalines, and which we were talking about earlier, about the great kind of the great absence of a great Dessalines sort of biography, which may now be in the course of being repaired. But we've got so many questions. Perhaps we could come back to that. I hope you don't mind, Rachel, because we're a little bit pressed for time. Tristan France says, it seems like you were touching on a new epistemology that incorporates animism into a Western framework, or vice versa. Could you talk a little bit more about this, particularly in the context of the Caribbean?
Okay, so the word animism, I never use it. I don't think I've used it ever. I have real fear of the word. It carries a lot with it, I think. I think I would rather think about the question by, see, because animism has this idea that you go, there's a tree, an animistic spirit, the tree spirit. And I could be wrong here, but let's say off the top of my head, what's unique to me about voodoo is that, a voodoo practice, is that the lois are not, they're not like, Damballa might be called the sweet serpent of the waters, but he's not a snake god. See, the thing that's fascinating to me about the spirit world is its personification. The fact that to practice is to then understand that the spirits are also persons, and they can take on, through possession, personhood, as well as the material envelope of the possessee. But it's that reciprocal tight bond between the serviteur and the loi that matters. In a sense, I think I wrote somewhere, there wouldn't be a loi if there wasn't the person. So they're not just sitting around within, they're not just inhabiting. These gods are not just inhabiting the landscape. I mean, there's a lot of spirituality to the earth, yes, but the loi themselves are lying in wait to come to be through the flesh of the person on the earth who receives them. So, in a sense, you do have a kind of mini incarnation, and this is what's fascinating. The way Catholicism was transformed by voodoo practice. Every single moment of the crisis of the loi, of what they call possession, is, in a sense, an incarnation in the moment. So you have eternity in the instant. To me, that's the most remarkable opening of possibility of a God, of a spirit world on the earth, out of the earth. And I think that is really what, as the Haitians understood, what Christ would have wanted. That's why, when I first got to Haiti, I'm Catholic and I serve the gods. André Pierre, the painter, and Ungon saw no divide between being, the Trinity and his practice. So to me, that's it. You inhabit what the others thought of as in conflict, dichotomous. And through that inhabitation, they become, in a remarkable way, over time, again and again, they become interchangeable, they become part and parcel of each other, and they move through the world that way. Voodoo cognition, the possibility of thinking anew, still lies in voodoo practice. And our politics would be very different if people understood how Haitians understood the very idea of hierarchy and how that works, you know, through voodoo.
Well, a couple of further questions about sort of influence and echoes in your work. So we've got a question about Brazier, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, says, in addition to the Faulknerian elements in your work, I also see your writing in symbiosis with poets like Dion Brand. I wonder if you had a conversation with Brand.
Did you say Dion Brand?
Dion Brand, yes.
Okay.
And then further down, Eva Hayes says, she'd like to learn more about the influences and how your thinking has developed over the years. I wonder, for example, how much Lauren Darby's work has influenced you. You talk about similar themes and popular narratives.
I'm sorry, that's very interesting. What was the name?
Lauren Darby, D-E-R-B-Y.
Oh, great. I have I'm not familiar with Lauren Darby. Can you, yeah, so I'd like to know more. I can't really.
Eva, do put, you know, Jana Brazil, sorry.
I will certainly look it up.
Yes, Eva, if you wanted to put, you know, things we should read in the Q&A box or on the chat bar, we can, that would be brilliant.
This would be great. So I'll be able to have the chats. Can you send, because when we say goodbye, the chats, can you retrieve them?
I can retrieve
I'd love to be able to have some time to answer them, but also to learn from them.
I think we can keep the chat. Sarah will, our torch will do that.
Yeah, there's so much there that.
But I'll keep the note for the Lauren Darby.
Yes, thank you.
So Dion Brand.
Excuse me, is Lauren Darby a poet too? No, I don't.
She's entirely new to me as well. So I'm
okay.
Oh, sorry, Robin brackets Lauren Darby, D-E-R-B-Y. History, a historian by the looks of things.
It's a historian, okay.
At UCLA. Dion Brand. We had a question about Dion Brand. Is Dion Brand a kind of an interlocutor in your work?
No, I mean, but I am going to be, I hope, teaching Dion Brand, and I'm trying to teach a course, and I hope it will happen, a graduate course on the long poem or the sequence poem. And I asked the question, you know, for so long, why were there no women writing the so-called long poem? But they are now. And of course, there's Dion Brand, and you know, there's Claudia Rankine, and of course, Audre Lorde, and there's Nikki Finney. So it's remarkable the ways in which women are writing the poetic sequence. And they are all about inhabitations in a sense, but that's a whole long, another, I think, a very distinct subject. Maybe another time we can, you can zoom into my class next year on the long.
I would love to actually. Yeah, I think that sounds like an absolutely fascinating question. So there's a question from Leah Gordon, and she's quoting from the Haiti.
Is this Leah? Did you say Leah Gordon?
I did, yes.
Hello, Leah.
And the quote is, why would such demanding gods, apparently counterposed to the historical realities of Haitian life, be invented by people in need of supernatural assistance? She says this is one of the most potent quotes from your book for me. Could you answer the question? Why did they?
Thank you, Leah. Well, you know, I was told, I don't, again, I think that, you know, a Haitian friend once told me something like, well, if you found a spot on a tree in high winds that was deeply threatened, that is where the spirit would want to be. Buffeted, contorted, and threatened. You know, I don't have an answer, but I do think that is the important question is, why would such spirits, why would such gods choose the least habitable places to be born, to live their lives? And I think that, Leah, you know why, or you have a sense why. I think that, I mean, the recalcitrant, the thing, or the mediums, the landscape that refuse us are the places where we most want to be. And I think, again, that contradiction, or the provocation to the safe and the secure, is what is promised by these choices that are made about how we pray, to what do we pray, and where do we find our gods. And thank you for that question. That's something to keep thinking about. It's important.
Wonderful. We've got about 7 minutes left, so we'll take a couple more questions.
7 minutes, my.
Time is
okay.
So Nicole Wilson asks, in the book, you ask the question, the book Haiti, History and the Gods, I presume you ask the question, what happened to actual Black women during Haiti's repeated revolutions as they were mythologized by men and metaphorized out of life into legend? And Nicole Wilson says that this important question is the driving force behind my own research, but I wonder if you have come any closer to answering it.
Beautiful, beautiful. No, you must do it. Let me tell you, the thing is that, yes, they were always those who most inspired, which is always a dangerous word, but they inspired, but they also were working, they were fighting, they were the fighters. That is a whole subject. The process of continued derailing and burial and transformation of the actualities of the flesh and blood women who were on the ground in Haiti. It was really tough when I was writing this to move, let's say, from Erzulie and my own mythologizing of the spirit and her power, to go to Marie Chauvet. The reason that I wrote that Chauvet section, Fictions of Haiti, is Chauvet was the only writer at that point, I thought, who cared about how we find women, how we retrieve the woman in this avalanche of male projection. And in Fond de Nègre, with Marie-Ange, she does it. And one of the big questions for all of you who work on Chauvet is Fond de Nègre has still, as far as I know, the Chauvet family has not allowed it to be translated, but that was, again, 10 years ago. I'm not sure where it stands now. But why? What is it about Chauvet's Fond de Nègre that is so threatening? Amour, colère, folie is translated, can be translated. Fond de Nègre is key. It was there that Chauvet began to take the terrain that is ignored and transform the very writing of a novel through it. I mean, it's the most remarkable book, and I know you have a lot to say about it, Will, as well. So I think that the only way I can really even move toward the answering of the question is to say that that is the future of, I think, writing about Haitian and religious practice writ large. How does, because if you've got the Virgin Mary, as you do in Haiti, everyone thinks, oh, well, look, there it is, woman, but it's their women. It's the woman, again, somehow symbolized or metaphorized out of existence. So it's to find a ground that one would say is the ground of the gods, where women, because they are in voodoo practice, I still say that in voodoo, women, there is a place that women inhabit that is radical. And of course, the most radical gods are those that are trying to destroy these gender distinctions. Always difficult to write about, but I'll stop there. There's a whole future of work in what Haitian voodoo practice can teach us about gender politics, as it were.
I'm very sorry. We'll probably have to finish there because we're going to get cut off in about a minute and a half's time. So apologies to David Howard, who's one of our co-conveners. So I hope you'll forgive that I didn't ask your question, and apologies to Rachel Douglas, because I can see there are two really interesting questions there that we have.
Yes, and let me just say, please write me. You have my email. If there are questions, I'd love to continue the conversation. So thank you, Will, for inviting me.
And thank you very much.
Okay, it was fun.
Yeah, so thank you so much. So Colin's new book, Animal Quintet, is, as she says, published by LARB Books this December. If you're a teacher or lecturer, please do use our videos in teaching, and we'll put up some further resources and a bibliography of all the things we've discussed and more things that Colin's recommended onto our website at torch.ox.ac.uk. In 2 weeks' time, Marisol Libron and Monica Jimenez from the University of Texas, Austin will be here talking about corruption and abuse in Puerto Rican Police Department with Maria del Pilar Blanco. And if you'd like to join our mailing list, please email myself or Michael. In the meantime, once again, thank you so much, Colin, for your wonderful seminars. Absolutely fascinating.
Okay, everybody be safe, stay cool, see you.
And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Then just another point, the next seminar is on Monday at 3 p.m, not on Tuesday at 2 p.m. So it's a day earlier. Thank you all very, very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.